I've read over 500 books, and in my journey to become a stress-free person, here are the 10 that helped me the most. It's not that any book is so good and contains God's truth to humanity. It's more about the timing of when you read the book. Where were you in that time of your life? What impact did it have at that time? Before I go into these books, I want to encourage you to be very thoughtful about what you choose to read. It's not about reading as many books as possible just for the sake of reading. I encourage you to be selective about the books you choose to read, and don't just read them. Study them and implement what resonates. So without further delay, here are the 10 books that had a big impact on me, and maybe they'll have a similar impact on you. So the first book is Awaken, the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. So I actually read this book when I was in middle school. My dad took me to go see Tony Robbins speak when I was 12 years old. And the biggest impact it had for me was around goal setting. So a couple of things that I think you should know about the book before you decide whether you're gonna read it or not. It talks about how your beliefs impact your actions, which impacts your outcomes. And that's a really big unlock when you start understanding how beliefs that you carry about how the world should work has such a big impact on your outcomes in life. By auditing those beliefs and challenging those beliefs and taking out poor beliefs that limit you and adding in more positive beliefs that make you stronger, a better person, you can really start to create the life that you want to be living. Which brings me to the second thing here, which is really the dangers of limiting beliefs. When you don't have awareness to what your beliefs are and which ones serve you and which ones don't serve you, you walk around with limiting beliefs that prevent you from getting where you want to go. If you've ever met somebody who has dreams and aspirations of being very successful, but they get stuck at one point and maybe they started a business, they got it to the 6 figures in annual revenue, and they end up shutting that business down and starting another one, and they get it to 6 figures, and then they shut that one down and start another one, they get it to 6 figures. It's not because the business was the problem, it's because they have limiting beliefs around income and how they can earn. The third thing that I really took away from this book is around managing emotions and how to stay optimistic. I believe, and this book really supports that being optimistic is an incredibly important personality trait for achieving inner peace and happiness. You really want to tint your glasses a bit rose-colored. It doesn't mean ignore things that are problems, far from it, but it means to have an optimistic view on your life and on the decisions that you make. And then finally, goal setting. And this was the biggest takeaway for me, and I carried around parts of this goal setting framework for decades. And here is what they teach in the book roughly. The first is allow yourself to dream without limitations. Think, what are some crazy goals that I want to accomplish? For example, when I first started my business 4 years ago, I went to Pinnacles National Park with my business partner. We hiked up to the peak, overlooking the entire mountainscape, the valley. It was absolutely breathtaking. And that's where we set our goals of what we wanted our income to be for our first full year in business. And on that mountaintop, we wrote 600,000 in revenue for our first year of business. And that seemed crazy to us. We had only done like 30K at that point, and that was in the past 6 months, and we were going into the new year, and so it was our first full year of business. As we start going down the mountain, we start changing the goal a little bit. That 600K goes to 450, which goes to 300K, which went all the way down. By the time we got to the bottom of the mountain, 150K. We did over 700 in our first year of business. It just goes to show we allowed ourselves to think big and dream big. And as we got closer down the mountain, closer to reality, we started changing the goals. And that's why you'll hear me say sometimes you never change the goal at the bottom of the mountain. Now, the second thing that Tony Robbins teaches is to take those big dreams and break them down into measurable goals, things that you can measure and that you can see with your eye how to achieve that one milestone. The next thing is you're going to set a timeline for when you want to achieve it. Then you tie each goal to a strong reason or meaning, and this is really important. You need to have a why behind the goal you're trying to hit that helps drive you towards it. So you really want to be intentional about the reason or the meaning why this goal is so important to you. Then you break down those goals into smaller, manageable steps that you can do regularly, maybe daily or weekly. And then finally, visualize as if you already have that goal achieved. And you consistently keep that visualization and you stay consistent executing on those small chunks daily and weekly that lead towards those bigger goals. And that's the framework that I have taken away from that book and I've continued using for decades. The second book is called Buddha's Brain by Rick Hanson, and it's about the practical neuroscience behind happiness, love, and wisdom. And this book is phenomenal. It by far is one of the most impactful books for me that I've ever read. And there's really one reason why, which I'm going to share with you. I read this book in 2016 and I still carry some of the lessons I learned to this day, and it had a big impact on how I manage emotions. This book covers a lot. It talks about the neuroscience behind mindfulness practices, and there's a lot to learn from it, but I want to share with you the one thing that has stayed with me the longest, and I repeat to a lot of people because it's such a powerful concept. And it's a story about two arrows, and it's an anecdote from Buddhism about two arrows. The first arrow is the one that happens to you. This is if you walk into your house, you take off your shoes, you step on a Lego on the ground, that pain you feel, that's the first arrow. The second arrow is your response to the first arrow. So in that example, you walk into your house, you step on a Lego, you go, ah, that hurt, first arrow. Then you go and you yell at your kids. That's the second arrow. Now, of course, you can control the second arrow because we can control how we react, right? We can't control what happens to us. We control how we respond. Well, here's the thing. Sometimes those second arrow reactions happen when a first arrow was never present. Have you ever gotten an email, read into it and got mad at somebody thinking they meant one thing, but really it was another? Or maybe you got a text and you got all mad, but they didn't really mean it that way. Sometimes we have those second arrow responses when no first arrow was present. And the book goes through 4 levels of awareness in order to overcome being slave to those second arrows. And here's what it goes through. The first level is totally oblivious. You walk in, you step on the Lego, that's the first arrow. Second arrow response you're totally unaware of, and you go and you yell at your kids. The second level is you start to realize, but you can't stop what's going on. You go in, you step on the Lego. First arrow hits you. Second arrow hits. You realize as you're getting emotional that you're having a second arrow response, but you can't stop yourself from going and yelling at your kids. The third level is you walk in, step on the Lego, you go, ow, pain. You have the second arrow response to want to go yell at the kids, but you're able to suppress it. Okay, that's the third level. And then the fourth level is you walk in, you step on the Lego, you take your foot off of the Lego, you bend down, pick it up, and put it away, and go say hi to your family. Total peace. You're not even a target of the second arrow, and that's a very special place to be. And that is what I took away from this book. The third book is End of Your World by Adyashanti, and this one is very deep. So I would only recommend this to you if you are more of a spiritual person and that spirituality and kind of the oneness of everything is something that actually interests you, because this is a very deep philosophical book, but had a tremendous impact on me that I think it's worth adding to this list, and it's probably not going to be on anyone else's list. So hopefully you hearing it from me is helpful. This book impacts me on a daily basis because it taught me how deeply integrated the ego is in our daily lives. And a lot of times we associate the ego with being egotistical or arrogant, and that's not the case at all. Oftentimes the ego lives under the surface and it's a driving force for a lot of the decisions that we make because it wants to be safe, it wants to be protected, and it's our sense of self. It's how we identify, and that ego is there to protect that identity at all costs. So by thinking it's just, oh, I don't have a big ego because I'm not going around yelling at people and demanding stuff, is totally incorrect, because your ego can sabotage you in plenty of other ways. And what this book taught me is how to identify the ego and what impact it's having on me, what beliefs it's forcing me to hold on to, and how it's trying to construct an environment that keeps it insulated and protected. And it's because it's my belief that the ego is the only thing that can truly die, because there is you, the true you, the deep inner you that has constant inner peace. And then there's the ego that's driving everything, trying to get you to do this and do this, to keep itself protected and let you live in a state of constant overthinking, fear and anger, sadness, these emotions that are pulling you side to side, up and down. You can be free of all of those if you choose to accept that inner peace and separate yourself from the ego. So there's a lot in this book around ego. There's a lot in this book in general about spirituality. There's a lot in there about aligning yourself with your true nature, and it's a really special read, but you have to be in the right place before you read it. I'm gonna share with you 3 of my favorite quotes from the book. I'm gonna read them to you, and I'll elaborate a little bit about why I like these quotes so much, and maybe this will help you determine if it's the right time for you to read it or not. So the first quote here, what we call ego is simply the mechanism our mind uses to resist life as it is. Life is happening like a river. It's just flowing. Whether you're there or not, it's flowing. If a tree falls in the middle of the wood and you're not there, it still fell, right? Nature keeps flowing. And what the ego tries to do is tries to put you in the center of that river. Like you could control that river. It wants you in the river, swimming upstream, trying to grab different things because it'll be fully in control. Oh, I want that thing up there. You could just wait, let the river flow around you, and it'll come. Or you could try to swim upstream to go and grab it, right? And that ego is such a powerful operator that we're often not super conscious of. So having that kind of awareness and acknowledging that the ego is a mechanism that the mind uses to resist life as it is a really powerful concept. The second quote here that I love, there is no resistance in your being, in your experience. Everything is flowing. Life is a flow. Everything just seems to happen of its own volition. And this really expands on what I was talking about before. Life is constantly happening, and you can't actually control it. Right? We talked about earlier, you can't control what happens to you. You can only control how you respond. And even beyond that concept, life is constantly going to be throwing things at you or around you. And there's going to be these things that are always going on. And oftentimes we feel, due to the ego, that we need to work to control of as much of that as possible. But you don't. You can simply just be. And that is incredibly powerful. Now, the third quote that I really love here is, what is required is the willingness to let life impact you, to let yourself see when life impacts you, to see if you go into any sort of separation about it, if you go into judgment, if you go into blame, if you go into should or shouldn't, if you start to point the finger somewhere other than yourself. The purpose of life is to appreciate your unique observation of life. That's what I truly believe. We are all an observer, and we get a very special, very, very special experience. And each of our experiences are different. We are there to appreciate that experience. And by taking on so much identity around the things that we have and the things that we do or we want to do and our emotions and anxieties and all of these things, by taking that in and identifying with it, we begin to trap ourselves in this illusion that is the life that is constantly flowing through us. When you can just separate yourself from it and you can look at that life, you can look at what's in front of you and not feel the pain that you feel when you're wrapped up within it. So if any of that was interesting to you, this would be a great book to read. The fourth book is Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. This is a fantastic book about leadership. I read this book when I first started leading a sales team because I really struggled with allowing people to do their own thing in order to hit the number. I was so controlling. I used to get very frustrated because people in the role didn't operate how I did when I was in the role. I was a young manager. I was just starting to learn how to be an effective leader, and a lot of the people I was leading were older than me. So there was this really tough dynamic for me to navigate, and this book gave me a lot of the tools in order to do so. So the 3 main things I took away from this, the first is that there are no bad teams, there are only bad leaders. I love that quote, and it's something that I think a lot about because the outcomes that your team is getting really is a reflection of you, if you're a leader, right? So by acknowledging that and owning that, then you can really start the process of identifying where the challenges are. Which leads me to the second thing here, which is prioritize and execute. Whenever you're doing something with your team, you're looking at what objectives need to take place, you're prioritizing those objectives, and you're executing it. And more importantly, you're giving ownership of that execution to the people on your team who need it. And then the third one here is discipline equals freedom. This is a great quote that I think about quite often. The more discipline you have in your life, the more freedom you have to do other things in your life, because that constant discipline gives you the clarity, the focus, the control of yourself that you need to be able to give yourself to everybody else and have that freedom to truly be a powerful leader. The fifth book is the Bhagavad Gita, which it's kind of unclear who the actual author of the book is, but it's part of Hindu scripture and it's a really powerful read, but also very old Eastern spirituality focused. So if you're not really into that kind of stuff, it might not be the right read for you, but I found it very powerful. I read this book a couple of months ago, and as I have been on this journey to live a life of inner peace, I find myself going further and further to the East, which is very interesting. And funny enough, also some Western early Plato, right? If you read some of Plato's stuff and you read some of this stuff from like ancient Hinduism, the Vedanta stuff, you read that, they're very similar. And what's funny is there's no real link there. So it seems like that these philosophies were developed separate from each other, but I'm no historian, that's just from my own research. I do find that very interesting. Now, when it comes to the philosophy of the East and even some of that Plato stuff, it really is the bedrock for philosophy. So it's interesting going that far back and reading texts that are like 5,000 years old. It's incredible. Overall, my big takeaway from this book is really how it talks about the nature of reality. Here's one of my favorite quotes. Having made pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat the same, engage in battle for the sake of battle. Thus thou shalt not incur sin. The idea here is making pleasure and pain and all of these emotions that drive a lot of our actions, make them all the same and just fight for the sake of fighting, live for the sake of living. And that's a very powerful concept to me and one that I've carried with me since I finished this book. What you start to learn is that a lot of our behaviors are dictated by our beliefs, which often are really structured around the fears that we have, the fears of being successful, the fears of failing, the fear of being alone or not being enough or being ostracized. Like all of these fears, this baggage that we carry, it shapes our beliefs and that shapes our behavior. And if you're not in the place you want to be in your life, and I mean that both literally, like you're not making the money you want to make, your life doesn't look the way that you want it to look, but I also mean internally. If you aren't in the place where you want to be, you have to understand that dynamic so you can choose to release those beliefs, release those fears, separate yourself from it, and align yourself with your true nature, which is inner peace, which is always there. Happiness isn't attained, it isn't found, it's always there. It's just being weighed down by the stuff that you carry. And by having an awareness, by reading some of these books like the Bhagavad Gita, you will start to understand what you have to do in order to release and then be more aligned with that inner peace. The sixth book is Antifragile by the author Nassim Taleb. So I read this book back in 2017, and this concept of anti-fragility really resonated with me. It validated some of the beliefs that I had and really helped shape some of the beliefs that I have around stress. That stress doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, stress is often what causes us to grow the most, right? So this is a really powerful book to help you understand that as a concept. It goes into a ton of different areas, so I don't want to go into all of that. I'm just going to share with you the message behind anti-fragile as at a high level so you can understand if this is the right book for you to read or not. So really where the word comes from is that there's no opposite of fragile. So if you have a box that says fragile on it and you drop it, whatever's in it breaks, right? It's fragile. Drop the box, you break it. If that box says durable, you throw it on the ground, nothing happens, right? Durable would be the opposite of fragile, right? It's not the true opposite, because when you drop the fragile, something happened, it broke. You drop the durable or the resilient, nothing happens. So what is the true opposite of fragile? Well, Nassim Taleb would argue it's anti-fragile, something that under stress Getting dropped actually makes it better. It's like a muscle, right? If you work out your muscles, you're tearing down the muscle fibers and they're growing back stronger. That's anti-fragile. And what really resulted in that is early in my career, I was a yes man. I would say yes to everything. Whether I knew how to do it or not, I knew I could figure it out. And that anti-fragile mindset allowed me to put myself in positions where I was incredibly uncomfortable, which in the future helped me a ton because I was very comfortable in a lot of situations because I seeked out everything. And there's a lot of wisdom from folks saying, say no, protect your time. Early in your career, that's total bullshit. You should put yourself into as many situations as humanly possible. Say yes to everything. Overload yourself because you're going to grow from it. And to rob yourself of that experience, to truly embrace being anti-fragile would be a big mistake. And I highly recommend you read this book if any of that resonated. The 7th book is Titan by Ron Chernow, and this is a biography of John D. Rockefeller, and it's incredible. I actually have it right there on my bookshelf, one of these little books right here, and it is such a fun read. First of all, I read a lot of nonfiction books, and most of those are very structured, and there's like a formula and things that you implement. This is a biography, and it's very fun to read. And my favorite story from this is about when John D. Rockefeller was earlier in his career. And by the way, this is in the 1840s. This is during the Industrial Revolution. There's no like electricity or anything. It's just a totally crazy time. And he's working at like a produce trading company, something like that. And he feels like he's working too much. He doesn't have very much work-life balance. So he decides to set a goal. Now, John D. Rockefeller is an avid goal setter, which is a kind of a cool takeaway from this book. And one of the goals he writes is, I will not be seen in the office past 10 p.m. That was his solution to not working too much. That's crazy. I mean, remember, there's no electricity, right? Like, this is an incredible, incredible person. It's just so cool reading about arguably the richest person to ever have existed and what their life was like. His mom was super frugal because his dad used to leave for months and even years at a time, and she wasn't sure if he was going to come back and actually pay the tab at the local store. So she was a big penny pincher, but his dad always came back, and his dad was like a vagabond. I think even like kind of a snake oil salesman, it seemed like. Just a interesting fella, very flamboyant with his money. He would come back, he'd pay the tab, and he was like a real spectacle. So he kind of had this weird life. And in business, he was very frugal too. He was a very, very intense negotiator. And just some of the things that he did, like trying to figure out what byproducts that he could sell from the oils and like the impacts that it had with the railroads, like just incredible what he was able to accomplish in one lifetime. And I don't know if you know this, but the government actually broke up Standard Oil, and I'll put a picture here. It turned into so many companies, and all of a sudden, like, these are massive companies that you know today that all came from Standard Oil, which is just an incredible accomplishment. And yeah, he totally had a monopoly, so I'm not here glorifying monopoly. I just find it very impressive that somebody in a time that was really different than what we have today. And of course, the Industrial Revolution was a big reason, right? Timing is super important. And he would not be nearly as successful as he ended up being if he wasn't born during the Industrial Revolution. That's not the argument I'm trying to make. It's just incredible to see somebody seize that moment and really build something spectacular. And look, there's companies today that's history is rooted in Standard Oil. And I think that's pretty interesting. The 8th book is The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. I absolutely love this book. I read this book about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and I was at a point where, as an entrepreneur, we run into this pretty often, where my happiness was really tied to how the business was doing. The business was doing well, I was doing well. The business was struggling, I was struggling. And as I'd set goals and milestones, we would get close to them, and I'd move the goalpost. And there were these different requirements in order to feel okay, feel happy. I mean, I remember telling my wife that once this happens, then I'll be able to work a bit less. And all of these things are lies, right? And this actually goes back to ego and some of the stuff that we talked about earlier. But they're more lies to myself. It's not like I'm consciously lying, right? This is just how entrepreneurs, we trick ourselves and we end up in this state of constant unhappiness. Now, I'm not saying I read this book and magically became happy, but it gave me a lot of tools that I needed in order to move the direction of more happiness and really help to find that inner peace. These, like I said in the beginning, these books, the timing is so important, and these are part of the building blocks that put together to get me to the place that I am today. The biggest takeaway from the book that I'll share here is that happiness is equal to a biological set point, conditions of your life, and voluntary activities. So for biological set point, it turns out that how happy you are really has a lot to do with your genetics. And everybody has this range of happiness, and some people genetically have a lower range of happiness. Other people genetically have a very high range of happiness. So myself, for example, I feel like I have a pretty high range of happiness. I'm generally a very happy person, so it puts me higher on that scale. But again, it is a scale, and you can feel very unhappy on the lower end of that scale, and your very unhappy might be a little less than somebody's happiness that they can become. So it's important to understand that your level of happiness may be different based on your genetics. But the other two components are really impactful to help you slide across that scale. So the next one is conditions of your life. These are the external circumstances of your life, how much income you make, your health, the people that are around you, the place that you live. All of these things contribute to where on that scale of happiness you are going to fall. And the final one are voluntary activities, things that you choose to do that have a big impact on your level of happiness. Things like what communities you choose to be involved in, what activities you partake in, do you exercise, do you not exercise, what hobbies that you have. All of this contribute to how happy you feel based on that scale that's set biologically. So if you'd like to explore what happiness is and how to achieve a higher level of happiness, this is a great book in order to figure that out. The ninth book here is The Score Will Take Care of Itself by Bill Walsh. And this is a great book about a legendary football coach and how he managed his football team and really worked to build a culture where we took ourselves seriously that led to an incredible performance on the field. And by the way, I know like nothing about football. I'm not a big football fan. This book is really good though. So even if you don't love football, I think you're going to take away a lot from this book. I read this about 3 years ago, about a year into my company, and it really helped me understand the importance of the activities. So I have always been a big fan of controlling the controllables. Do what you can in the moment, even the little things. And over time, the outcomes will come. So I feel as a person, I'm already hardwired towards the small things that lead to the big things. But at this point in my career, there's a lot of debate in sales circles about tracking outcomes. And, oh, we only care about the outcomes. The inputs don't matter nearly as much as the outcomes. It's about quality, not quantity, this type of stuff. And this book really shines a light on the power of the activities. Things like wearing your socks right for a football team and showing up to practice on time. These little things that are totally in our control. It eventually results in the score taking care of itself. If you do all of the actions to the best of your ability, the outcomes will come. So this book is one that I highly recommend because it's great for leaders to better understand what actually matters when it comes to running their teams and focusing on the controllables. But also as a person, it can help us get more focused on the now and the things that we're doing today and have confidence that by doing these actions today, we will get to the place that we're trying to get. It'll take care of itself. So let's just focus on the now. Last, but certainly not least, is the book Good to Great by James Collins. I read this book a solid 5 years ago when I started getting more and more serious about the idea of going off on my own and starting my own business. I had 2 kids at the time, now I have 3. I was at the time the only income earner for the family, and that was for a long period of our life. I was the only income earner. So I started to get a lot more curious about what makes exceptional companies exceptional so I can work to embody a lot of that in the company that I choose to build, and I eventually did build. And Good to Great is an incredible book about that. This book is filled with awesome takeaways. If you have any interest in building a company, you should absolutely read this book. It's recommended by a lot of people for a reason. Here are 3 takeaways that I really like from the book to just give you a sense of what types of things it talks about. The first one is that great companies focus a lot of energy on getting the right people on the bus and the wrong people off of the bus. And that lesson is so critical and helped me a lot as I started to build my team. And now I feel very fortunate to have a team of incredible people that I can rely on. And it gives me a lot of freedom to be able to focus on other areas of the business without feeling like I need to keep one toe in to something that I hired someone else to do in the first place. The second thing is Great companies don't hide from brutal facts. They tackle those brutal facts head on. And sometimes, whether it be market conditions or how parts of the business are functioning, we want to be blind to those realities. And a great company isn't blind. It tackles those head on and works to solve or work around whatever that condition is. And the third one here is that great companies have a culture of disciplined thought and action. They don't just shoot from the hip. They don't just say random stuff. They don't play whack-a-mole with the initiatives that they choose to focus on. They're very disciplined about how they think through problems, how they think through solutions of those problems, how they prioritize what to work on, and having that disciplined thought and then that disciplined action really helps build a foundation and a culture of an incredible company. So these were 10 of some of the most impactful books for me. And if you would like to learn how you can stop overthinking, then check this video out and I'll see you there.